When an empath goes quiet, it's already over. There is a moment in every empath's life that no one notices. It is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is not announced, it is silence. And when an empath goes quiet, it's already over. Let's understand why. Silence is rarely the beginning of an empath's withdrawal. It is the end of a long emotional journey that most people never see. Before the quiet comes effort. Before the detachment comes devotion. Empaths are not impulsive in relationships. They are deeply invested. Their brains are wired for attunement. They notice micro-expressions, subtle changes in tone, the emotional temperature of a room. This heightened sensitivity is not dramatic. It is neurological. Mirror neurons fire quickly. Emotional data is processed constantly. They feel what is spoken and what is withheld. Because of this awareness, empaths often overfunction in relationships. They anticipate needs before they are voiced. They apologize for tensions they did not create. They adjust their behavior to preserve harmony. Emotional intelligence allows them to read between the lines, but without firm boundaries, that same intelligence can become self-sacrifice. They begin to carry emotional weight that was never theirs to hold. At first they communicate, they explain how something felt. They try to clarify misunderstandings. They give context. They hope that if they express themselves clearly enough, the other person will meet them with the same depth. When that doesn't happen, they try again, softer this time, then firmer, then with visible hurt. Emotional exhaustion does not happen in a single argument. It builds through repeated experiences of being unheard, dismissed, or minimized. The empathy's nervous system remains on alert, scanning for connection, scanning for repair. When repair doesn't come, cortisol rises. Fatigue sets in. What once felt like devotion starts to feel like depletion. There is a psychological tipping point where the empath realizes the emotional exchange is unequal. They are pouring empathy into someone who does not or cannot reciprocate. This recognition is painful because it challenges their hope. Empaths believe in growth, in conversation, in healing. Letting go feels like failure, so they hold on longer than most would. But the body keeps score. Chronic emotional strain creates internal shutdown. The empath stops initiating difficult conversations. They stop correcting misunderstandings. They stop expressing hurt because expressing it no longer feels safe or productive. This is not indifference, it is protection. Silence becomes a boundary when words no longer work. Instead of reacting, they observe. Instead of explaining, they conserve energy. The warmth that once flowed easily becomes measured. Their laughter is quieter. Their responses are shorter. The emotional labor they once performed instinctively is withdrawn. To the outside world, it may look like moodiness or distance. In reality, it is a nervous system choosing stability over chaos. The empath is no longer fighting to be understood. They are fighting to remain intact. By the time silence appears, exhaustion has already reshaped the relationship internally. The empath has shifted from hope to acceptance. They are no longer trying to fix what feels chronically unbalanced. They are learning that empathy without reciprocity becomes self-abandonment. And once that awareness settles in, their quiet is not confusion. It is clarity. By the time an empath grows quiet, something profound has already happened internally. They have grieved the relationship long before anyone else realized it was ending. Unlike impulsive departures fueled by anger, an empath's detachment is preceded by deep emotional processing. They do not wake up one morning and decide to stop caring. They slowly come to terms with what is no longer working. Empaths reflect constantly. After conversations, they replay them. After conflicts, they analyze not only what was said, but what was meant. They ask themselves difficult questions. Did I overreact? Did I expect too much? Could I have communicated better? This internal review is not insecurity. It is their commitment to fairness. They genuinely want to understand both sides. At first, this reflection strengthens the bond. It encourages accountability and growth. But when patterns repeat, when apologies change nothing, when promises fade, When emotional availability remains inconsistent, reflection turns into realization. And realization is where grief begins. Grief does not only belong to death, it belongs to unmet expectations. It belongs to the slow recognition that the version of the relationship you hoped for may never exist. Empaths feel this deeply because they attach not only to who someone is, but to who they believe that person could become. Letting go of potential can hurt more than letting go of reality. So they begin grieving quietly. They grieve the conversations that never happened. They grieve the effort that wasn't matched. They grieve the intimacy that felt one-sided. This grief happens while they are still present. They may still show up, still smile, still respond, but internally they are loosening their attachment. Their nervous system begins adjusting to the idea of separation. Their expectations lower, their emotional investment becomes cautious. The powerful thing about private grief is that it creates closure before departure. By the time an empathy physically withdraws, they have already cried the tears. They have already processed the disappointment. They have already imagined life without the connection. This is why their silence can feel sudden to others. But it was never sudden. It was gradual acceptance. And acceptance changes everything. Once an empath accepts that their emotional needs will not be met in the way they deserve, persuasion loses its power. Promises feel late. Dramatic gestures feel reactive. Because internally the goodbye has already been spoken. When an empath grows quiet, you are not witnessing confusion. You are witnessing completion. They are no longer fighting for the relationship in their mind. They are releasing it there first. And once the mind lets go, the heart soon follows. When an empath goes quiet, it often means the emotional door has closed. Not with anger, not with drama, but with a calm finality that is easy to underestimate. Empaths are communicators by nature. When they care, they reach out. When something feels off, they try to repair it. When they feel hurt, they attempt to translate that hurt into words. Their voice is their bridge to connection. So when the voice disappears, something fundamental has shifted. Emotionally intelligent individuals understand that connection is sustained through responsiveness. It is not perfection that keeps relationships alive. It is repair. A missed moment can be forgiven. A misunderstanding can be clarified, but repeated emotional neglect, subtle dismissal, chronic defensiveness, lack of accountability erodes safety. And safety is the foundation of vulnerability. Empaths do not stop speaking because they have nothing to say. They stop speaking because speaking no longer feels effective. There comes a moment when they recognize that their words are being tolerated, not absorbed, heard, but not understood. A conversation requires two nervous systems willing to regulate together. When one side consistently resists reflection or avoids emotional depth, the empath begins to feel alone even in dialogue. Loneliness inside communication is more painful than silence. At that point, the empath's energy shifts. They begin conserving rather than investing. Instead of initiating difficult conversations, they observe patterns. Instead of confronting every small rupture, they allow distance to grow quietly. This is not manipulation. It is recalibration. The emotional door does not slam shut. It closes gently. First, they stop over-explaining. Then they stop correcting misconceptions. Then they stop trying to be deeply known by someone who has shown limited capacity to understand them. When an empathy decides not to express something that once would have mattered deeply, that is not indifference. It is closure forming. The brain, when exposed to repeated relational stress, shifts towards self-preservation. Emotional labor becomes selective. Attention becomes guarded. The empath begins asking internally, is this safe? Is this mutual? Is this worth the cost? And if the answer continues to be no, withdrawal follows naturally. To the other person, it may feel like the empath suddenly became distant. In reality, the empath simply stopped holding the door open alone. And here's the critical truth. Once the emotional door closes for an empath, reopening it requires more than apology. It requires consistent safety, demonstrated change, and restored trust. Because by the time silence appears, the bridge they once maintained so carefully has already been dismantled. They are no longer trying to reach you. They are returning to themselves, and that return I. Rarely reversed to someone on the outside. It can look sudden. One day the empath is engaged, responsive, emotionally present. The next day they seem composed, distant, almost unaffected. People often ask, what changed? But what looks like an overnight shift is actually the final stage of a long internal recalibration. Empaths detach in layers. At first, they give the benefit of the doubt. They assume stress, misunderstanding, or emotional immaturity. They increase patience. They increase understanding. They try to regulate not just their own emotions, but yours. This is the first layer, overcompensation. When that doesn't restore balance, they move to the second layer, reduced reactivity. They stop reacting to small disappointments. Not because they don't notice them, but because they are measuring the cost of engagement. They begin asking themselves whether every issue is worth emotional expenditure. The third layer is subtle but powerful. They stop sharing their inner world as freely. The stories become shorter. The vulnerability becomes selective. They no longer expose their deepest fears or dreams in the same way. This is not punishment. It is discernment. Then comes emotional neutrality. This is often misunderstood. Neutrality can look like maturity, calmness, even peace, but psychologically it can signal detachment. The empath is no longer riding the highs and lows of the relationship. They are observing instead of participating. They're gathering data instead of investing hope. Detachment in this sense is strategic, not calculated in a manipulative way, but adaptive. The brain is designed to protect against repeated pain. When emotional bids for connection consistently fail, the mind reduces attachment intensity to minimize further harm. By the time silence arrives, the empath has already practiced living without emotional reliance on the relationship. They have imagined their independence. They have emotionally rehearsed separation. They have strengthened parts of themselves that once leaned heavily on the connection. So when they finally step back, it feels steady. There are no dramatic confrontations, no explosive endings, just a quiet shift in energy that signals finality. The most surprising part is that this detachment often comes with clarity rather than bitterness. The empath is not seeking revenge. They are seeking alignment. They are choosing environments where their empathy is reciprocated rather than consumed. And once self-respect becomes stronger than attachment, tolerance for emotional imbalance disappears. That is why it feels sudden, because what you are seeing is not the beginning of it. One of the quietest but most powerful shifts that happens before an empath withdraws is this. They stop seeking validation from the very person they once hoped would understand them. Empaths naturally look for mutual meaning. When conflict arises, they don't just want to win an argument. They want to emotional resolution. They want to feel seen. They want their inner experience acknowledged. In psychologically healthy relationships, this validation strengthens attachment and deepens trust. But when validation is repeatedly withheld, minimized, or redirected, something changes internally. At first, the empath tries harder to explain. They refine their language. They soften their tone. They choose the right moment to speak. They hope that better communication will unlock empathy in the other person. When that effort goes unmet, they often begin questioning themselves. Am I too sensitive? Am I expecting too much? This self-questioning reflects high self-awareness, but without reciprocity, it can slowly erode confidence. Eventually, a realization forms. The issue is not clarity, it is capacity. Not everyone has the emotional capacity to validate depth. This realization is pivotal, because once an empath understands that their emotional needs are unlikely to be met in his space, they stop asking for them. They no longer wait for reassurance. They no longer look for emotional acknowledgement. They no longer attempt to prove that their feelings are reasonable. This is not emotional shutdown. It is emotional independence emerging. Psychologically, validation regulates the nervous system. When someone says, "I understand why you feel that way," the body relaxes, safety increases. But when validation is chronically absent, the empath learns to self-validate instead. They begin meeting their own emotional needs internally. They journal instead of confide. They reflect instead of request, reassurance. They process pain privately rather than risk dismissal again. And here is the critical shift. Once someone learns to validate themselves consistently, external validation loses its urgency. The empath is no longer emotionally dependent on being understood by you. This changes the dynamic entirely, because persuasion, charm, and even apologies depend on emotional access. But when an empath no longer needs you to confirm their worth or interpret their experience, that access narrows. They are grounded in their own perception. They trust their emotional intelligence again. And once that trust is restored within themselves, they stop negotiating it externally. When an empath grows quiet, it often means they have stopped looking to you for something they have finally learned to give themselves. And that kind of independence is rarely reversed. When an empathy goes quiet, many people assume it is punishment. They interpret the silence as manipulation, passive aggression, or an attempt to provoke guilt. But in most cases, the quiet is not about control. It is about peace. Empaths are not strangers to emotional turbulence. They have spent months, sometimes years, navigating tension, overthinking conversations, carrying unspoken disappointment, trying to regulate both their own feelings and someone else's. That level of emotional vigilance is exhausting. It keeps the nervous system in a near constant state of alertness. Silence for them is relief. It is the first full breath after holding emotional weight for too long. When they stop arguing, it is not because they have nothing left to say. It is because they no longer want to fight for understanding. When they stop reacting, it is not indifference. It is the absence of emotional chaos. The body no longer braces for impact. The mind no longer rehearses explanations. Peace feels unfamiliar at first, almost empty, but then it feels stabilizing. Psychologically, humans are wired to move toward environments that feel safe. When a relationship consistently triggers anxiety, defensiveness, or disappointment, the brain begins associating that connection with stress. Even if love is present, chronic stress erodes attachment security. At some point, the empath recognizes that staying emotionally engaged is costing them more than leaving quietly. This recognition is not dramatic, it is steady. They begin noticing how calm they feel when they are no longer trying to fix things. They notice how much mental space opens when they stop analyzing someone else's behavior. They realize their energy returns when they are not overextending empathy. That calm becomes addictive, not because they stopped caring, but because they started caring about themselves. Silence, then, is not retaliation. It is restoration. It is choosing nervous system regulation over emotional chaos. It is choosing self-respect over repeated compromise. It is choosing internal alignment over external approval. And here is what makes this stage so final. Once peace replaces attachment anxiety, the empath rarely volunteers to return to turbulence. You cannot compete with someone's inner stability. When an empath becomes quiet and remains calm, it signals completion. They are no longer trying to change you. They are no longer trying to change themselves for you. They are simply stepping into an environment, internal and external, that feels emotionally sustainable. Their silence is not meant to hurt. It is meant to heal. And when healing begins, the chapter that caused the wound has already closed.